Welcome back. We are still inside Justin Waller's world today. This one is all about the messy part, scaling, getting punched in the face, and coming back sharper. Also, somehow fitness, women, money, and self-respect all end up in the same soup, which honestly feels accurate for a real entrepreneur. The part that hit me first was how he made a tiny company look enormous. Bro was out there using templates like he had a whole army behind him. 4 guys, 5-page proposal, and enough confidence to annoy entire counties. That's not fraud, that's branding with extremely aggressive posture. But I get it, because in construction, people judge size before they judge skill. And if you look too small, you never even get invited to the game. Exactly. And then he just kept flooding every general contractor with bids. Not even politely, just full blast, everywhere all at once. That's such a savage growth strategy, because it is annoying until it works. It feels like the lesson is less be perfect and more be impossible to ignore. Yeah, and he was obsessive about proof, signs, photos, social media, the whole thing. Which is funny because a lot of people think growth is only about skill. Sometimes growth is just making sure everybody knows you exist. That's so bleak, but yes. What I liked most was that he tied it to repetition, not magic. He was basically saying the business got bigger because the system got louder. And then there is the habit piece, which I think people underrate. The morning drives, the gym, the quiet time, that whole thing. The weird part is that the quiet seems to be where his confidence comes from. That's the part I think people miss when they chase motivation. He wasn't saying wake up at 4 a.m. to cosplay toughness. Right, he was not selling a sleep deprivation religion. He was saying the mind gets loud when life gets quiet enough. And that's actually useful, because most people never sit long enough to hear themselves think. That line about guarding the gates of your mind was strong, because it is not just inspirational, it's practical. If your feed is junk, your goals start feeling fake. If your feed is junk, your brain starts eating junk too. Then people act surprised they have no ambition. He even made the towel analogy work, which is ridiculous. Like fear is often just bad lighting on something harmless. I actually think that's why young people stay stuck. Not because they are lazy, but because everything feels mysterious. And once they learn the thing, the fear collapses. He said it over and over in different ways, but the core was always exposure. Travel, meet different people, learn different systems, see bigger rooms. That changes your standards without you even realizing it. Also, his line about everybody being more similar than they seem was underrated. Hometown people versus city people versus rich people, same insecurities, different shoes. That perspective makes his ambition feel less like betrayal. Because leaving home is often what lets you realize home was not the ceiling. That is such a heavy but useful thought. Then he got into the pain point that actually made him level up, which was brutal. $1 million down, payroll stress, cards maxed, house remortgaged. That's not entrepreneurship, that's a stress documentary. And somehow the lesson was still calm down and restructure. That is the part people glamorize from a distance and hate in real life. You do not really learn from easy wins. You learn when the company is bleeding and your ego has nowhere to hide. He basically said failure forced him to become a better operator. Which is rude but effective. Rude is the right word for business, honestly. I also liked that he was honest about taking losses on jobs and still keeping relationships alive. That is not sexy advice, but it is real trust building. And it works because contractors remember who disappears. The market is smaller than people think. Everybody loves saying they have character until the numbers get ugly. Then character becomes a luxury item. His point about being known for staying in the fight was strong. Because in real industries, reliability is a weapon. And the weird thing is that reliability compounds like crazy. One good job becomes 10 more conversations. One bad exit becomes a permanent reputation. That is terrifying and fair at the same time. The social media piece was interesting too, because he did not frame it like entertainment. He framed it like a movement, and that changes the whole energy. That was the first time the branding made emotional sense to me. People are not just following content, they are following permission. Permission to think bigger, work harder, or stop apologizing for wanting more. And he knew the value of coming from a real world, not just talking about one. That credibility matters, especially when your online voice gets loud. Also, I love that he basically said he was too honest to launch a channel early. Some people wait until they have content, others wait until they have morals. That is actually a nasty line. The relationship advice was also way more disciplined than people expected. He was not chasing, he was staying on mission and letting the right people notice, which is annoyingly simple if you strip away all the macho noise. He basically said women can tell when a man is actually building something. And if he is not, they can tell that too, immediately. That is why purpose reads louder than pickup lines ever will. The best part of the whole conversation, though, was how he talked about self-respect. Working out, showing up, auto-drafting savings, building habits. It was all basically a system for trusting yourself. That is the real wealth, if we're being honest. Because if you cannot trust your own follow-through, money just becomes drama. And he was very funny about that too, like, make yourself broke. Aggressively responsible, but make it stylish. His whole thing about putting money into assets that do not need you was smart. That is the difference between income and escape velocity. And then the best advice he gave at the end was probably the simplest. Go quiet, listen inward, and stop outsourcing your destiny to other people's opinions. That sounds almost too simple until you realize how many people never do it. Most of the time, the answer is already there. People just keep refreshing everything except their own thoughts. That is the most modern disease ever. So yeah, that wraps this one up, and honestly, the whole series has been a lot of fun. Justin gave us a really raw look at what building actually costs, and somehow made being obsessed with habits sound cooler than being flashy, which is hard to do because flashy people never shut up. Thanks for riding with us through the series, and we will see you on the next one. And hopefully with fewer maxed-out credit cards in the story. Welcome back. This episode is all about how Justin scaled from small jobs to a serious business. He also gets into mindset, habits, and why leaving home can change everything. And honestly, the guy makes growth sound like a war movie with spreadsheets. The wild part is how much of it started with just looking bigger on paper. Which is insane because that is basically startup energy with steel beams. He had 4 guys and was out here acting like a giant contractor. Honestly, that is either genius or complete delusion, and sometimes those are cousins. But the thing is, he didn't just fake confidence and pray. He built a system around it and kept sending bids until people couldn't ignore him. Bro, sending bids to all 10 general contractors even when only one invited him is wild. That is such a disrespectful amount of ambition. I love that he was basically like, I'm on the list now whether you like it or not. And that ties into something he kept saying about conviction. If you do not believe your product helps people, nobody is buying your face. Especially if your face looks like you know it is snake oil. Exactly, people can smell fake confidence from a mile away. But what I liked is that he wasn't talking about hype. He was talking about responsibility. Like, if you think you're actually helping somebody, the sale becomes simpler. It becomes less about persuasion and more about clarity. Which is probably why he sounded so intense about it. He talks like he is personally offended on the customer's behalf. But then he flips it into operations, and that is where it gets real. Because once the jobs started coming in, he had to build the machine underneath the confidence. And that is when he hired the estimator full-time and started pushing 5 or 6 bids a week. 5 or 6 bids a week is not a business. That is a factory with caffeine. I can barely answer one email without questioning my entire existence. Meanwhile, this man is out here trying to cover $20 million of work. And he is doing it while still being the guy who has to make sure the sign is up and the photos get posted. That part matters more than people think. He understood visibility before people even used the word brand correctly. He was basically doing content marketing in a hard hat. That's the exact vibe, just with a lot more dirt and less lighting. The other thing that stood out was how he talked about losing money and staying in the fight. He wasn't pretending losses are fun. He was saying they teach you what actually needs to change. Getting punched in the face financially is apparently a leadership development program. The most expensive MBA in history. But that $1 million stretch really showed how close scaling can get to collapse. And he didn't save it with some inspirational poster nonsense. He stepped back, rewired contracts, employees, subcontractors, clients, all of it. Basically, he rebuilt the airplane while it was still in the air. That is terrifying, but that is also exactly what real business looks like. And then there is the habit stuff, which he treats like a secret weapon. The gym, The drives, the quiet mornings, all of that was about hearing himself think. I actually loved that part because it felt less like productivity and more like self-respect. He was saying the answer is usually already there if you can shut the noise off. Which is annoying because it means the problem is us again. That is the worst possible ending for a self-help story. But it is also why the feed conversation hit so hard. He is basically saying your mind is getting trained by whatever you keep feeding it. So if your feed is garbage, your thoughts are going to be garbage with better lighting. That is brutally accurate. And he was not being dramatic about it either. He was being practical. He is telling young people to go learn money, learn history, learn how the world works. Not just watch random chaos all day and call it information. A radical suggestion in 2026. Crazy concept, I know. I also thought his point about people around you was really strong. Not in a toxic cut everybody off way, but in a very honest way. Some people love you and still quietly try to slow you down because your growth makes them uncomfortable. That line hurts because it is true more often than people admit. Aunt Sally has ruined more progress than bad credit ever could. Leave Aunt Sally out of this. She is just trying to feed people pudding. But his answer was not to hate people, it was to stay focused anyway. That is the part I respect most because bitterness is usually just lazy protection. He also had that hilarious moment where he basically said money is not his god. Then immediately explained how freedom and doing what he wants are pretty close. And that actually makes sense when you hear how he talks about taking care of people. A lot of his motivation is really relational, not ego-driven. That's why the success feels bigger than the toys. The story about the internet clip was another good one, too. He got dragged online, and his reaction was basically, "My real life is too good to care." That is elite emotional immunity. Imagine being so content that a viral hate clip is just background noise. That only happens when your real world is actually solid. And then the dating advice was funny because it was half philosophy, half chaos. He basically said, keep building and women will notice the mission. He really did say if you are moving, people jump in front of you. Which is a wild visual, but somehow it works. The deeper point is still discipline attracts attention. Not game, not performative masculinity, just actual momentum. And the funny part is, he said he was asleep and gone at 4 in the morning. That is not romance. That is industrial-level priority management. I liked his advice for nervous young people in rooms with powerful people, too. He said, shut up, listen, and make the older guy feel like the hero. Honestly, that is such a good social cheat code. People love talking about themselves, especially when they think they are mentoring you. And if you are humble enough to ask good questions, you get real information. That is how you enter a room without pretending to be the smartest person there. Which is a relief because pretending is exhausting. The physical health part also tied everything together for me. He sees fitness as discipline you can actually see. Like, you can fake a lot of things, but you cannot fake shoulders for that long. The body always keeps receipts. And when he says he would trade money for his body, that is not a joke. It is saying health creates more options than money alone ever can. That is a pretty clean way to think about it. Same with the financial advice, honestly. Auto draft, invest early, buy assets that do not need you. He literally said, make yourself broke on purpose so the system works for you. Which sounds insane until you realize he has probably been right for 20 years. And it is very hard to argue with somebody who is building long-term wealth in public. The piece about wanting to avoid becoming the guy who was rich once was great too. That is a very specific fear and a very real one. People often think wealth is about the purchase, but it is really about the structure. And he kept pointing back to residual business models, not just hustle. Which is probably why he told his younger self to pick something with return forever. There is a maturity in that answer that a lot of people miss. He is not chasing a moment, he is trying to build a machine. And maybe that's the whole lesson of the episode. Momentum is not luck, it is just repeated decisions made under pressure. That should be embroidered on a shirt and sold for way too much money. People would buy it too because it sounds harder than it is. But the deeper thing he left us with was identity. Who you listen to, what you feed your mind, what you repeat daily. That is the part that actually changes someone. And that is a perfect place to wrap this final episode and the whole series. Justin was intense, funny, blunt, and weirdly thoughtful all at once. Which is honestly the best possible podcast combination. If you listened through both episodes, thank you for riding with us. Go back, take notes, and maybe clean up your feed while you're at it. That alone might save somebody a few years of confusion. We will see you on the next one. Welcome back. We are finishing the series with Justin's business grind and mindset shifts. This one gets into growth, habits, money, and why leaving home changes everything. Also, he says some wildly blunt stuff, which is always good radio. He basically turned construction into a sales machine with enough confidence to annoy the planet, which honestly is a skill. Wait, he was sending bids to contractors who never even invited him? He just kept showing up like, no, you're going to know my name today. That is such a cold growth strategy, though. It is. And the wild part is it worked because he looked bigger than he was. Fake it until the proposal packet looks expensive enough to scare people. That's the most construction founder thing I've ever heard. But the real lesson is he was relentless about being seen, not just being good. Yeah, and then the hard part was surviving when the business got too big too fast. That $1 million hole he described sounded brutal. House mortgage, maxed credit cards, payroll stress, all of it at once. And that is the part people never see behind the success story. What I liked is he didn't pretend the failure was poetic. He basically said, I got punched in the face until I got smarter. Sometimes business education is just expensive pain. But he did something important. He stepped back and rebuilt the whole structure. Contracts, employees, clients, subs, all of it. That's not motivation, that's a full corporate emergency. Bro had to become the architect of his own rescue. And the habit stuff was strong too, especially the quiet drives and gym routine. I actually love the idea of being alone enough to hear your own thoughts. Most people are drowning in noise and calling it normal. The feed advice was probably the biggest take-home for me. If your phone is feeding you nonsense, your brain is getting trained by nonsense. He said, go search for money, real estate, history, and stop doom scrolling. A shocking amount of life improvement is just uninstalling stupidity. That's absurdly accurate, unfortunately. And then the other huge theme was physical health as a confidence engine. He made a good point that discipline in the gym teaches discipline in business. Also, people absolutely notice when you walk in the room looking strong. You cannot outsource that kind of presence. The money advice was probably the most boring and useful thing he said. Auto-draft it away before you can spend it. He basically said, make yourself broke on purpose and then get good. Which is horrible advice if you are irresponsible and perfect if you are serious. I also liked the part about wanting to be remembered as relentless and big-hearted. That is a real legacy answer, not a branding answer. And that is where we will leave the series. Business, mindset, discipline, and momentum. If this episode helped you clean up one habit, that is a win. Thanks for listening to both episodes, and we will catch you on the next one.